And shout out to the old oh boy. Shout out to the old spinster, okay? The old mill spinster. Mr. Darkwing Duck himself. And at that last post, sir, uh, you have forfeited the right to even go back and forth with me. Okay? I'm just presenting my information. And if you Google, you get the same sources that I did. uh, Silly duck. Anyhow, I mean, I do mean it. Um, I saw the post. I'm not even going to look at it because, like I said, I am not even going to go back and forth with. I'm just presenting my evidence. Okay. And this is by Gene Kaiser Jr. The absurdity of slavery as the cause of war between the states. Slavery as the cause of war of the American war between the states is an absurdity of biblical proportions. The great historian Shelby Foote was right when he said that slavery. I remember Shelby Foote saying that was not the true cause of the war, and said it was an element of the war, but it was not what the war was really fought about. Right? It wasn't. The war was really fought about whether the federal government should dominate state government. In other words, it's basically states' rights, which is true, which is something that goes all the way back to 1812. Okay, I have written a book entitled "Slavery Was Not the Cause of the War Between the States: The Irrefutable Argument," in which the argument is laid out in detail with 218 footnotes and over 200 sources. In the bibliography, in this brief article, I would like to touch on the main reasons that why slavery was not the cause of the war. The primary cause of the war between the states was the impending economic annihilation of the North. When the first 7 states seceded. I told you it's about money. The rapid deteriorating northern economy created a backdrop of extreme fear, unrest, and anger in the North. It drove all the actions of Lincoln and the Northern leaders in the winters and spring of 1861. A solution had to be found quickly, or a major catastrophe was going to happen in the North and lead to the worst anarchy and, at best, a greatly diminished economic position in the world. That is true. The United States was broke. That's why they passed the tariffs in the first place. Just the talk of secession caused horror and panic to many, such as the Daily Chicago Times, which wrote in December 10th, 1860, a week before South Carolina's secession convention was to convene. In one single blow, our foreign commerce must be reduced to less than one half what it is now. Our coast-wide trade would pass into other hands. One half of our shipping would lie idle at our wharves. We would lose our trade with the South, with all its immense profits. Most 70% of the at least 70% of the foreign trade, in other words, exports, came from the slave South. Okay, there's several books: Empire Cotton, The Real Lincoln, said it. What is it? Accounting for Slavery. There's a lot of different books that said the exact same thing about the profits globally, not just in the European northwest, but also globally. That the products that came out of the American South went global. Okay, 80% of the raw materials came from the slave South into the European North. Our manufactories would be in utter ruins, let the South adopt the free trade system or that of a tariff for revenue, and these results would likely follow. If protections be wholly withdrawn from our labor, it could not compete with all the prejudices against it. It was the labor of Europe we should be driven from the market, and millions of our people would be compelled to go out of employment. Northerners quickly discovered their enormous wealth and power, as well as most of their employment were dependent on South manufacturing, captive Southern market, and shipping Southern cotton. Cotton alone look at this. Cotton alone was 60% of U.S. exports. Southerners were growing 66%. Southerners were growing 66% of the world's cotton. This is why they were upset. But Northerners shipped that cotton and handled virtually everything else, making immense profits in the process. Without the North, the South was in great shape with 100% control of King Cotton. Without the South, the North was dead. To make matters worse, the insatiable greed of Northern leaders in Congress who were utterly ignorant of basic economic principles led directly to the devastating mistakes as the astronomical moral tariff. Okay, remember I was telling you about the moral tariff? The moral tariff threatened to instantly reroute most U.S. trade from the North to the South because of the South's low tariff. Protective tariffs were unconstitutional in the South, where free trade philosophy reigned. This is actually protective tariffs versus free trade. Okay, this is where the idea of free trade, as we now know it, came from. Right, the moral tariff added 47 to 60% to goods coming into the North. Okay. Compare that with the South's 10% tariffs for the operation of a small federal government in the states' rights nation. Okay? As with all protective tariffs, of the antebellum period, the Northerners who passed the moral tariffs assumed it would fall on the South. However, the South was out of the Union and no longer obliged to pay the Northern tariffs. This one fell on the North with disastrous effect. Economic historian Philip S. Foner, in his excellent book, Business and Slavery, The New York Merchant and the Irrepressible Conflict, writes, on April 1st, the moral tariff would go into effect, and after that date, the duties and the principal articles of import would be nearly twice as heavy at New York as they would be at New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah. The consequences of this difference in duties were not difficult to see. Anything that had happened thus far in the secession crisis was mild compared to the impending immediate future what the immediate future would bring. The moral tariff was like pumping gasoline into a fire. It was a 1-2 punch for the North. The North had lost its manufacturing market because the Southerners were dying to get out from under the exorbitant Northern prices jacked up by the federal government, which gave Northern businesses protective tariffs, bounties, and subsidies. In other words, the tariffs, this is something that's going on right now, okay? The tariffs would have made goods more expensive. Okay, which because of the North, to be competitive was already more expensive. Texas Representative John H. Reagan, Reagan, okay, Northern representatives in Congress in early 1861. You are not content with the vast millions of tribute we pay you annually under the operation of our revenue law, our navigation laws, your fishing bounties, and by making your people our manufacturers and our merchants and our shippers. Georgia Senator Robert Toombs called it a suction pump, sucking wealth out of the South and depositing it in the North. And it was made up of bounties, protection to every interest and every pursuit in the North, to the extent of at least 50 million per annum, besides the expenditure of at least 60 million out of every 70 of public expenditure among them, thus making the Treasury a perpetual fertilizing stream to them and their industry, and a suction pump to drain away our substance and parts of our lands. Henry L. Benning, one of Robert E.'s most able brigadier generals, for whom Fort Benning, Georgia, okay, was named, okay, said 85 million, a gargantuan sum in those days, was the amount flowing continually through a Robert Toombs suction pump. 85 millions is the amount of the drains from the south to the north in 1 year. 3/4 drains in return for which the South receives nothing. And the prescient Benning also said the North, cut off from the Southern cotton, rice, tobacco, and other Southern products, would lose 3/4 of her commerce. Yep, 75%. A very large proportion of her manufactures, and thus those great fountains of finance, would sink very low. Would the North, in such a condition as that, declare war against the South? So the North had lost its manufacturing market due to greed and abuse via the federal government, and now it was going to lose its shipping industry overnight, again because of greed. The unbelievable greed of the moral tariff as northern ship captains beat a path to the South, Farner goes on. The war of the tariffs has been ignored in most studies devoted to the antebellum period. That's true. It's never mentioned. Yet it is doubtful whether any event during those significant months prior to the outbreak of war was as influential in molding public opinion in the North. Certainly in New York City, it caused a political revolution. It brought to an end any hope that the Union could be preserved peacefully. Southerners were paying 3/4 of their taxes going to the federal treasury, but 3/4 of the tax money was being spent in the North. How long do you think the Northerners would tolerate paying 3/4 of their taxes if 3/4 of the tax money was being spent in the South? Very true. And this is the same theme that has that we've been talking about in all of the papers. Same shit. This is something that Lorenzo did point out. Said no wonder the northern states loved the Union, and no wonder Abraham Lincoln said over and over for the first 2 years of the war, the purpose of the war was to preserve the Union, not in slavery. In fact, there are documents that said that even Lincoln was willing to compromise on slavery. That's why Lincoln supported the Corrin Amendment, which left black people in slavery. Now look that one up. Would left black people in slavery forever, even beyond the reach of Congress. He used it to lobby seceding governors to stay in the Union. Interesting. I gotta look that one up. Duck, Darkwing, can you hear me? The Corn Amendment. Okay. Never heard of it, but we are going to hear about it now. I'm going to look that one up. That's why the North War Aims Resolution of July 1861. This war is not waged upon our part in any spirit of oppression, nor for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, nor for the purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights of institutions, i.e., slavery, okay, of the states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution which allowed and protected slavery to and to preserve the Union. That's why the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862 said, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States of America, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy thereof, do hereby proclaim that I declare hereafter as heretofore, the war will be prosecuted for the object of practically restoring the constitutional relation between the United States and each of the seceded states. The great Southern writer William Gilmore Simms said, no doubt that in one sense they, the Northerners, cherish the Union, but only as the agency by which they could prosper in unaccounted prosperity. It is to them the very breath of life. It has made them rich and powerful and keeps them so. No doubt they love the South, but it is as wolves love the lamb, coveting and devouring it. For the North, the war was not about ending slavery. 4 slave states fought for the North throughout the war. Kevin says you cannot make this shit up. 4 slave states fought for the North throughout the war. 4, count them. The 5th Union slave state was admitted to the Union during the war. It is an indictment of the North that so few slaves lived in Union states. Yet the North still refused to abolish slavery. For the North, it was about preserving the Union, which is the source of Northern wealth and power. It was about establishing the supremacy. It's about establishing something they're still arguing about, the supremacy of the federal government over the states. Northerners were the Federals during the war because that arrangement allowed the North to control business and rule the entire country with its larger population, and it flowed money into the North from the rest of the country. Even Northern anti-slavery was economic, and it is misnamed. It should have been called anti-South instead of anti-slavery because it was in no sense pro-black. Charles P. Rowland said there was a significant and economic dimension to Northern anti-slavery sentiment, and the racial factor contributed to the Northern attitude because many Northerners objected to the presence of slavery in their midst in part because they objected to the presence of blacks there. The objection to the presence of blacks was also why many Northerners did not want slavery in the West because they didn't want blacks near them in the West, and most northern western states, including Lincoln's Illinois, had laws on the books forbidding free blacks from living there or even being there longer than a few days. Historian David M. Potter states that Northern anti-slavery was not in any clear-cut sense pro-Negro movement, but actually an anti-Negro aspect and was designed to get rid of the Negro. From the beginning, Northerners, especially New Englanders, were America's slave traders who the British before them brought most of the slaves here and made huge fortunes. In the process, even after the slave trade was outlawed in 1808, we know why it was. That was the external slave trade. Northerners still carried on vigorous right vigorously right up to the war. Besides, genuine abolitionists in the North were only 2 to 5% of the electorate, and many were hated. Elijah Lovejoy had been murdered in Illinois in 1837. Charles Dickinson, the great British writer, also published a periodical all the year round and was up on current events and horrified by the American War. He said, "Every reasonable creature may know, if willing, that the North hates the Negro, huh, and that until it was convenient to make a pretense that sympathy was with him was the cause of the war. It hated the abolitionists and derided them up the hill and down the dale." Dickens also said the federal government compelled the South to pay heavy fines into the pockets of the northern manufacturers, so that every feeling and interest on the one side, South, called for political partition, and every pocket interest on the North side for the Union. For the South, 1861 was like 1776 all over again. That is what Rhett said in his declaration, or his speech to the Southern states. The war was about independence, self-government, and maintaining the republic of the Founding Fathers, in which the states were supreme and the federal government weak and subservient. We still talk about that today. Okay, this is where your so-called right-wing talk comes from, right? Sometimes even your left-wing talk says the exact same thing. It was about economic independence and free trade, and not about being ruled over by the Republican Party. Interesting. Which had used, now the Republican Party is about free trade and unbridled trade and individual rights and this kind of shit. Right now the Republican Party is the vanguard of it. Interesting. Which had used unbridled hatred and encouragement of terrorism to rally its votes. George Washington had warned that sectional parties would destroy the country, but Wendell Phillips proudly proclaimed the Republican Party is the party of the North and pledged against the South. For the North, war was better than anarchy, as Philip S. Fauner notes. It was also exceedingly logical that when all the efforts to save the Union peacefully had failed, the merchants, regardless of political views, would have endorsed the recourse to an armed policy. And when they finally became aware of the economic chaos secession was causing. It's all about the Benjamins, is it not? When they saw the entire business system crumbling before their very eyes, they knew that there was no choice left. The Union must be preserved. Any other outcome meant economic suicide. After goes to his footnotes. The Manchester, New Hampshire Union Democrat wrote on February 19, 1861, one day after Jefferson Davis' inaugural, the manufacturing departments, we now have the almost exclusive supply of 10 million of people. Can this market be cut off? We not feel it. Our mills run now. Why? Because they have cotton. Interesting. Our mills run now. Why? Because they have cotton. But they will not run long. We hear from good authority that some of them will stop. In 60 days, they went on. When people realize that the fact that the union is permanently dissolved, real estate will depreciate one half in a single year, our population will decrease with the decline of business, and matters will go in geometrical progression from bad to worse, so all of us will be swamped in utter ruin. The moral tariff made things worse. March 12, 1861, editorial, we shall be done for a revenue. 10 days after the passage of the moral tariff, the New York Evening Post warned of the hopelessness of the northern situation. allow, allow railroad iron to be entered at Savannah with a low duty of 10%, which is all that the Southern Confederacy uh, think of laying on imported goods, and not an ounce more would be imported at New York. That's true. The railways would be supplied from the southern ports. Let cotton goods, let woolen fabrics, let the various manufacturers of iron and steel be entered freely at Galveston, at the Great Port, at the mouth of the Mississippi, at Mobile, at Savannah, and at Charleston, and they would immediately be sent up the rivers and carried on the railways to the remotest parts of the Union. The New York Evening Post goes on to say that if the taxes weren't collected from the South, then the sources which supply our treasury would be dried up. We shall have no money to carry on the government, and the nation will become bankrupt before the next crop of corn is ripe. Tennessee Representative Thomas A. Nelson, who had submitted the minority report of the House Committee of 33, observed firsthand the crumbling northern economy. In a speech just before the war, he said, 3 short months ago, this great nation was indeed prosperous and happy. What a startling, wondrous change has come over it within that brief period. Commercial disaster and distress pervade the land. Hundreds and thousands of honest laboring men have been thrown out of employment. Gloom and darkness hang over the people, and the tocsin of war has been sounded. The clangor of arms has been heard. Representative Nelson is talking about the North only, where the tocsin of war has been sounded and the clangor of arms has been heard. Down south, there was no such feeling of desperation, only triumph, patriotism, and jubilation over independence. Imagine the calculation in the mind of Abraham Lincoln, the president of the North, and his region collapsed. He could see no way out. He knew the South controlled the most demanded commodity on the planet, cotton. Well, I tell you. And he knew the South was tight with England and seeking to be tighter. He knew that once the Southerners completed the trade and military alliance with Great Britain and other European countries, the North would not be able to beat the South. Okay. In other words, once Europe starts arming the South, then they wouldn't beat them. Because of cotton, the South would ascend to dominance in North America, trading freely with the world. Interesting. The Confederate Constitution encouraged free states to join the Confederacy. Slavery was not required. Slavery was not required. Slavery was up to each individual state. Okay. Southerners were convinced that several northern and western states, especially those among the great rivers such as the Mississippi, would join the CSA, and this petrified Lincoln. Southerners would also start manufacturing for themselves very soon. Okay. Lincoln knew he had to get the war started as quickly as he possibly could. With each day that went by, the South got stronger and the North got weaker. There was no such advantage to waiting a second longer. He was anxious to put up a naval blockade and force Europe to take a wait-and-see attitude. Interesting. Wait-and-see attitude toward the South. Then he could let the North's huge advantages, such as 4 times the white population and almost all of the country's manufacturing, an army and navy with fleets of warships, a functioning government with unlimited immigration for the army, huge advantages with armaments, etc. Where out the South, war would also solve his political problems as people rallied to the flag. The economic issues in play in the spring of 1861 are far more powerful causes of the war than slavery. I have only scratched the surface in this short article. And there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, he has 22. He has 22 footnotes. But I am definitely going to look up the Corwin. The Corwin Amendment. I am definitely going to look that one up. So, all you folks, you history buffs, okay, this is just another article, okay, in the mix, and there's more to come.